After 10 years of being called the erratic dropout, I didn't just show up to my golden brother's wedding rehearsal. I arrived as the secret owner of the $100 million luxury resort, and my family thought was solely a symbol of their success. This is my story.
Looking back, the clarity of the memory is unnerving, like examining a polished gemstone under a high-powered lamp. I sit now on the western terrace of the Cay, the scent of white ginger and salt-laced air entirely mine, 3 weeks after Arthur Sterling learned the precise cost of denial. It was never about bitterness, though the public record often suggests otherwise. It was about the simple, fundamental physics of being visible, the effort required to exist in a world actively curated to deny your presence. For 10 years, the Sterling family had perfected the art of the editorial crop. If a photo was published from a family holiday or a milestone celebration, I was inevitably positioned just outside the frame, or blurred into a background detail. If my name arose in conversation, the topic was immediately shifted with a soft, practiced cough. The narrative they preferred was tidy and digestible for their peers. Rhys, the erratic but essentially harmless younger sibling, was living quietly on a distant inheritance. This lie provided the acceptable social distance required to explain my absence from Julian's meticulously planned ascension, the golden trajectory that led directly to his wedding at the Saffire Cay Resort. Arthur Sterling, my father, was the chief architect of this erasure. His disdain was never loud, it was carried in the precise, weighty manner he held his Scotch glass, the slight downturn of his lip when discussing my supposed European sabbatical. He had an innate elitism that viewed anything deviating from his predetermined path as fundamentally broken. My decision a decade prior to forego the predictable path of East Coast finance for global hospitality development, the path that required gritty work in port cities and obscure investment hubs, was not a career choice to Arthur Sterling. It was a failure of character, a prolonged adolescent tantrum. I recall the last time I tried to explain the scope of my initial project, a small boutique restructuring in the Cyclades. He listened, nodding slowly, and then responded, "Rhys, darling, when you are done playing at hotels, the door is always open at the firm." The dismissal was not venomous, it was surgical. It reduced years of 18-hour days, grueling acquisitions, and complex financing rounds to a child's game of pretend. That sting, the cold, definitive judgment, hurt. It lodged itself beneath the ribs, a piece of shrapnel that refused to dissolve. But pain, I learned early, is only debilitating if you let it echo. Silence, conversely, is fuel. I stopped arguing, stopped sending updates, stopped challenging the public narrative that I was either in crisis or too fragile to manage responsibility. They wanted quiet, I gave them absolute stillness. While they dined on the fruits of their status, I spent a decade meticulously drafting blueprints, securing equity, and negotiating the complex environmental permits for a development that was, ironically, too ambitious for Arthur Sterling to have ever conceived. Their sustained, collective ignorance became my greatest strategic advantage. They were looking for the distraught daughter who needed rescue, they missed the industrialist who needed only space and time. Every time Julian's engagement was mentioned in a society column, always framed around the generosity of the Sterling parents in funding the exorbitant affair, I felt that shrapnel shift. It didn't bleed, but it hardened the resolve. They were building their narrative on sand, I was building my reality on bedrock and a 7-figure construction loan. The irony, sharp and undeniable, was that the more extravagant Julian's wedding became, the more the Sterling family solidified their delusional claim to success. They needed the most exclusive, most unattainable location to signal their arrival at the pinnacle of high society. They needed a backdrop that spoke of impossible luxury and financial effortlessness. They needed Saffire Cay. My core desire was never to punish them, but simply to be recognized, not for my connection to their name, but for the labor of my own hands. That desire, denied for so long, had matured into the quiet, complex engine driving the entire Saffire portfolio. I did not want their approval, I wanted the record corrected. The invitation arrived late Tuesday afternoon, 3 days before the first chartered flight was due to land. It wasn't the thick, embossed cardstock Julian had sent out months ago. It was a terse, logistical text message, relayed by Julian's highly paid wedding coordinator, who likely didn't know who I was, only that I was an unavoidable name on a list. Rhys confirmed your arrival on the 1800 hours private shuttle Friday. Please proceed directly to the staff marina for transport to the Cay. Your parents insist you be present for the rehearsal dinner, though seating will be discreet. Saffire Cay Logistics team seating will be discreet. The phrasing was vintage sterling, minimizing my profile even as they demanded my presence. I read the message, watching the sunset bleed crimson over the infinity pool of the main resort, a sunset that was, technically and legally, mine. I replied instantly, simply, understood. Expect me. It was the first acknowledgement they had received from me in 3 years. The silence was over. The structure I had spent a decade building was ready to receive its first, most important occupants. The decade between my quiet departure and my strategic return was not a sabbatical, nor was it a period of inherited leisure. It was a precise, grueling exercise in operational invisibility. The Sterlings had assumed that without their public endorsement, I would simply cease to generate gravity. They confused financial backing with sheer willpower. Arthur Sterling always measured worth in the proximity to established power, the gleaming marble of a Wall Street lobby, the inherited leather of a traditional partnership. My power, conversely, was forged in the periphery, in the concrete dust of burgeoning economies, the high-stakes negotiation rooms of state-owned enterprises, and the scent of brine mixed with diesel fuel on developing coastlines. While Julian was being groomed to navigate the smooth carpets of the finance world, I was learning to manage labor disputes in 5 different languages and secure mezzanine financing that required triple-digit confidence. I remember a winter in Valletta, Malta, 5 years into my self-imposed exile. It was the period when the Saffire concept was still a collection of complex environmental impact studies and dizzying land acquisitions. I was living in a sparsely furnished apartment overlooking a shipyard, wearing the uniform of the working industrialist, pressed trousers, practical layers, and the permanent weariness of someone who deals in global logistics. The phone rang, an unwelcome intrusion from New York. It was my mother, her voice strained and performing the role of the worried socialite. "Rhys, darling, your father is hosting a small reception for the museum board. Senator Vance is going to be there. I need to know what to tell people about your plans." I paused, listening to the echoing clank of cranes outside my window, a sound that felt more authentic than any silver-plated social gathering. "Tell them the truth, Mother," I said, my voice level. "That I am currently involved in a complex infrastructure project in the Mediterranean, requiring significant capital investment and political sensitivity." The resulting silence crackled with indignation. "Rhys, don't be facetious. Arthur just told the Van Ambers that you are enrolled in an exclusive European wellness retreat. We just need a simple narrative." This was the crux of the erasure. My reality was inconveniently large and fundamentally rejected their core belief that I was incapable of serious effort. They could not reconcile the daughter they knew with the industrialist I was becoming. "Then use the simple narrative you already created," I replied, employing the gray rock method, the polite, neutral silence that offered nothing for them to leverage or emotionally exploit. "I am fine. I am busy. I will be in touch when my work permits." I hung up, not with anger, but with the cool realization that their sustained ignorance was a protective shroud. Every time they repeated the lie, that I was living quietly or in crisis, they lowered their defenses, allowing me to build Saffire Cay into an unassailable fortress of success beneath their radar. The flashback, the first denial, the absolute clarity regarding my necessity to disappear dates back 2 years prior, a specific evening that served as my initiation into the physics of denial. Julian was receiving an award, a manufactured honor perfect for photo opportunities. The family was seated at the head table, draped in the obligatory prestige. Arthur Sterling, standing at the lectern to introduce Julian, glanced over the assembled crowd of his peers. The transition from general remarks to family history was seamless and chillingly rehearsed. "Our son, Julian," Arthur began, his voice resonant and commanding, "represents the best of focus and dedication. His sister, Rhys, as many of you know, is currently undertaking a much-needed period of rest. She has always been sensitive, a true artist, and she is pursuing that distant inheritance in the European hills, ensuring she is well rested when she finally returns home to us. The lie wasn't just a social lubricant, it was a character assassination disguised as paternal concern. It reduced my entire existence, my drive, my competence, my ambition, to a feminine fragility that required rest. I wasn't in the European hills. I was 2,000 miles away in an investment firm's boardroom in Singapore, signing off on the debt facility that secured the initial acquisition of the Saffire Archipelago. I excused myself from the table, stepped into the hallway, and watched the live stream on my phone. When Arthur Sterling finished his address to polite applause, I felt a deep, cold severance. That night, I realized I didn't just need distance, I needed irrefutable proof of my capacity. The pain lodged beneath my ribs, the piece of shrapnel Act 1 referred to, had found its purpose. It was no longer a wound, it was a compass pointing only toward achievement. Over the next few years, while the Sterlings were consumed by the details of Julian's rising social stock, the engagement party, the society columns, the frantic planning for a wedding that needed to be the wedding of the season, I was consolidating the Saffire portfolio. I oversaw the deepwater dredging, the importation of native flora, the complex construction of the subterranean infrastructure that supported the appearance of effortless luxury. The Sterlings demanded the best, the most unattainable venue to signify their financial invincibility. They chose Saffire Cay, never asking who owned the cay, only if the cay could be bought for their purposes. This oversight was Arthur Sterling's defining flaw. He always assumed that anything truly valuable had to be purchasable, not generated by hands he personally dismissed. Now, standing on the terrace 3 weeks after the fact, looking down at the staff marina where the Saffire Siren was currently berthed, I appreciated the elegance of the timing. The logistical text message demanding my discreet seating for the rehearsal dinner was a final act of attempted control. Seating will be discreet. They planned to hide me in the corner while they celebrated their curated success. What they failed to grasp was that discretion, for 10 years, had been my chosen strategy. The private shuttle was due in 20 minutes. I smoothed the lapel of my tailored ivory blazer. I wasn't traveling discreetly, I was traveling as the proprietor. I walked to the helipad, not towards the main reception, but toward the executive complex, where the chief executive of the managing hospitality group, a man who reported directly to me, was preparing his welcome toast. The time for silence was officially over. The time for the record to be corrected had arrived. The transition from the cool, corporate efficiency of the executive complex to the blinding, performance-grade luxury of the main resort terrace was immediate. Stepping onto the Saffire Terrace, I was walking into a room I knew intimately, but one that was now overlaid with the humid, anxious energy of the Sterling's social performance. The rehearsal dinner was less a meal and more a choreographed declaration of wealth. The Sterlings had demanded a sunset reception, and the architecture I commissioned provided it, designed specifically to capture the last, molten light of the tropical evening, reflecting it off the imported, sand-hued travertine flooring. The lighting, a delicate system of hidden uplights, was set to a perfect 4,000 Kelvin, chosen to flatter expensive jewelry and aging complexions. Everything was pristine, curated, and utterly artificial in its perfection. I watched the scene unfold from the periphery of the main archway, letting the high society hum wash over me. The sound was a specific, heavy blend, the low, confident tone of men discussing M&A, the brittle laughter of women in new silk, and the precise clink of bespoke crystal against the thick, custom linen tablecloths. The air smelled of salt and the wildly expensive, short-lived arrangement of white orchids flown in from the Netherlands, a vendor I knew was paid on the 15th of every month by the Saffire Portfolio Accounting Office. There was Arthur Sterling, positioned perfectly at the center, radiating the satisfied assurance of a man whose world was aligning exactly as he decreed. He stood beneath an intricate, hand-carved pergola, a detail I had fought fiercely for in the initial design, holding a scotch that caught the light like liquid amber. He was in his element, holding court, his chest expanded by the perceived success of the evening. His gaze swept the crowd, not checking on guests, but measuring the precise depth of their appreciation for his extravagant generosity. He was the conductor of this symphony of status, unaware that the orchestra pit, the music stands, and every instrument were collateral for my construction loans. Before Arthur could spot me, the logistics team, the human shields of the Sterling's embarrassment, moved. A young woman in a discreet black uniform, Julian's hyper-efficient wedding planner, detached herself from the main group, her expression strained but polite. "Rhys? Thank heavens you arrived. We have your seating confirmed. It's a lovely corner table, quite private, perfect for minimizing any distractions." She lowered her voice conspiratorially, as if we were both protecting Arthur from my existence. "Distractions?" I repeated, the word tasting clinical on my tongue. I stepped fully into the light, allowing her to take in the tailored lines of my attire, less socialite, more CEO, a subtle but deliberate rejection of the quietly inherited leisure aesthetic they preferred. "Well, you know," she fluttered, gesturing vaguely toward the high table where Julian and his fiancée were basking. "Family drama. We want the focus on Julian tonight." Naturally, I agreed, my gaze fixed on the travertine floor. "But I won't be needing the corner table." She looked genuinely panicked. Mrs. Sterling insisted. "It's all been arranged. They prefer you settle in quietly. We really can't have any last-minute changes. The seating chart is engraved." The engraved seating chart, another small, physical representation of their absolute belief in control. "I appreciate the effort," I told her, my voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying the undeniable authority of an owner speaking to an employee. "But the layout of this venue is custom designed for maximum sightlines. I need a clear view." I bypassed her stunned silence and moved deliberately toward the open space near the podium, the location designated for the evening's welcoming remarks. It was not a table, but a vantage point. The guests nearest the podium looked up, recognizing the errant sister from the few, unavoidable photographs they had seen. A ripple of curiosity replaced the low hum of conversation. Arthur Sterling finally saw me. The precise moment of recognition was chillingly satisfying. His expression didn't immediately register anger, it registered confusion, quickly followed by the proprietary annoyance of an audience member whose attention is diverted mid-performance. He set his scotch glass down with a heavy finality. "Rhys," he called out, his voice carrying the forced volume he used to impose order. "You're late. The shuttle was delayed, I presume." "Well, you found the right spot. Go ahead and find your mother, she'll show you where you've been placed." His insistence on where I'd been placed was the ultimate attempt at confinement. He was defining my space, my relevance, my role, a supporting, non-speaking extra in his opulent stage production. I did not move toward my mother. I stood exactly where I was, just beside the ornate podium that contained the custom-designed audio system. I glanced down at the sleek mahogany wood, noting the slight imperfection in the grain that only the person who approved the final stain would know. Arthur, seeing my immobility, started walking toward me, his brow furrowed in paternal warning. "Rhys, don't be difficult. People are starting to notice." "I expect so," I replied, allowing a small, cool smile to touch my lips. The high society guests were indeed noticing. They saw the dramatic juxtaposition, the towering Arthur Sterling, the picture of East Coast financial pedigree, facing off against the younger, quieter figure who refused to be ushered away. Just then, the lighting dimmed slightly, signaling the beginning of the official program. A tall, impeccably dressed man in a charcoal suit, Mr. Elias Thorne, the chief executive officer of the global hospitality firm managing the Saffire portfolio, ascended the podium. Thorne was my operative, the man who had facilitated the venue booking with the Sterlings, adhering to my strict instruction to never disclose the ownership structure. Elias Thorne tapped the microphone, the small sound echoing perfectly through the resort's state-of-the-art sound system. He was the only person present who knew the intricate geometry of the coming moment, and his eyes met mine, a brief, professional acknowledgement of the curtain rising. Arthur Sterling paused, sensing the shift in attention. He glared at me, leaning close. "Move, Rhys. Now. The management is about to speak." "I know, Father," I said, turning my focus to Elias Thorne. I approved the speaking order. Thorne began his welcoming toast, his voice smooth and projecting confidence over the assembled dignitaries. "Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed guests, on behalf of the Sterling family, and the entire team here at Saffire Cay." Arthur Sterling was still standing uncomfortably close, ready to physically nudge me away from the podium, when Thorne reached the core of his remarks, the mandated, unavoidable declaration of ownership. Thorne paused, catching the attention of every guest. "This island, this resort, this entire vision of luxury, represents a decade of unparalleled strategic investment and profound vision. It is, simply put, the crown jewel of the Saffire portfolio, and the entire team is honored to host Julian and his beautiful bride. But tonight, we must raise a glass, not just to the happy couple, but to the person whose ambition and hard work made this entire experience possible. To the chief investor and principal owner of the Saffire Cay Resort, and our esteemed host for the evening." I watched Arthur Sterling's face fracture as the CEO turned, extending a dramatic, welcoming hand directly toward me. Rhys Sterling. The structure I had spent a decade building held perfectly. It was not the dramatic explosion of a shouted confession, but the quiet, devastating precision of professional recognition that shattered the Sterling's constructed reality. Elias Thorne, ever the impeccable operator, stood at the podium, his hand extended toward me. The sound system, which I had personally tested for acoustic perfection, amplified the pronouncement, lending it the weight of undisputed fact. Rhys Sterling. Looking back, the silence that followed was the most expensive sound I have ever produced. It swallowed the high society hum, the clatter of silverware, the brittle laughter, the low, confident drone of the male guests, and replaced it with a heavy, vacuum-sealed stillness. For a full 3 seconds, the only noise was the distant, rhythmic wash of the Saffire Cay tide against the imported white sand. The focus, the very gravitational center of the rehearsal dinner, was pulled away from the golden couple and fixed entirely on the spot where Arthur Sterling stood, frozen halfway between paternal admonition and complete disbelief. His face, engineered for decades to convey authority and unflappable control, fractured. The polished facade crumbled first at the corners of his eyes, which darted between Thorne's outstretched hand and my calm figure. I watched the realization dawn, the extravagant backdrop for his son's ascension, the most exclusive, financially unattainable venue he could secure, was not an assertion of his wealth, but a monument to my capacity. Arthur's hand instinctively reached for the Scotch glass he had set down moments before, only to find the marble cool and empty. He needed the prop, the physical anchor of his status, and found it gone. The sudden lack of control over his own environment seemed to physically shrink him. The embarrassment was not localized to Arthur, it radiated outward. My mother, seated at the head table, instinctively brought a delicate hand to her throat, her expertly trained social smile freezing into a mask of acute mortification. She was watching her husband's carefully cultivated narrative dissolve in front of the precise people whose approval sustained her life. Julian, the golden child, looked genuinely lost, glancing around the room as if expecting the entire elaborate display to be a poorly orchestrated prank. I felt a profound, quiet stillness. There was no need for grand gestures. I simply allowed Thorne's hand to remain pointed toward me, accepting the acknowledgement with a subtle nod that conveyed nothing more than, yes, this is true. Move on. Thorne, professional to a fault, recovered quickly, his tone shifting to include the entire party. As the owner and host for this celebratory weekend, he continued, directing his remarks back to the head table, we hope you enjoy the unparalleled amenities of the portfolio. Now, let us raise a glass to Rhys Sterling, and to the happy couple, Julian and, the glass raising was tentative, laced with professional uncertainty. The guests, predominantly Wall Street peers and legal associates of Arthur Sterling, were now performing rapid, silent mental arithmetic. They understood capital. They understood infrastructure. The sheer scale of Saffire Cay represented a financial undertaking that eclipsed anything Arthur Sterling had ever managed. They were looking at the person Arthur had dismissed as in crisis, and seeing, instead, an industrialist who had outpaced their own collective ambitions. Arthur Sterling finally moved. He approached me, not with fury, but with the chilling, contained aggression of a man fighting for the last scrap of his dignity. His voice was a whisper, a desperate attempt to contain the damage within our shared, private history. "This is beneath you, Rhys," he hissed, leaning in so close I could smell the expensive scotch already on his breath. "This is a vulgar, expensive stunt. You put our name, my name, on the ownership ledger for a resort, just to perform this pathetic act?" He was still trying to reduce my success to an adolescent tantrum, unwilling to accept the structural depth of the achievement. I met his gaze, observing him with the same detached clarity one uses to critique a flawed architectural drawing. "It's not a stunt, father," I replied, my voice calm, contrasting sharply with his frantic energy. "The name on the ledger is simply the legally verifiable truth. I financed the acquisition, managed the environmental planning, and directed the construction. The Saffire portfolio is the result of 10 years of labor you insisted didn't exist." The crucial part of the correction was that it was directed only at him, yet its consequence was entirely public. "You have spent a decade telling society that I fled responsibility, that I was too fragile for finance, that I was playing at hotels," I continued, my gaze sweeping briefly over the exquisite terrace, the hand-carved pergola, and the perfectly curated white orchids. "This entire, lavish weekend, the signal of your supreme status, is being held on the bedrock of the success you denied was possible." I paused, allowing the weight of the realization to settle on him. "I didn't need your approval, Arthur Sterling. I needed the record corrected. And tonight, in front of the audience you chose to validate your own success, the record has been corrected." I turned from him, my movement final and decisive. The moment demanded no further words. The effort required to be visible had been expended. The denial that had been lodged beneath my ribs for 10 years was not just dislodged, it had been inverted, transforming the very ground he stood on. I was no longer the daughter who was out of frame. I was the host. The invisible labor was now undeniable structure. The ledger was balanced. 6 months after the rehearsal dinner, the Saffire Cay Resort had settled into the quiet, lucrative hum of its peak season. The incident, the public, irrevocable correction of the Sterling family narrative, had faded from high society gossip and settled into the permanent, institutional history of the financial district. I found myself in the private, executive library of the Cay, an area designed for quiet contemplation and financial review, far from the polished marble of the main resort. The library was paneled in dark, cool cedar, the scent of which mixed with the distant, faint perfume of salt carried on the air conditioning. I was no longer examining the past under a high-powered lamp, I was simply living within the structure I had built. The shrapnel that had lodged beneath my ribs for 10 years was not merely dislodged, it had ceased to exist. Pain requires an active wound, I had closure, a condition far more sterile and permanent than forgiveness. Arthur Sterling, naturally, had attempted to control the fallout. His initial reaction, the whispered assertion that the Saffire portfolio was a vulgar, expensive stunt, had become his public statement. He insisted to his peers that Rhys was merely holding the assets in trust for a distant relative, or perhaps fulfilling some eccentric tax requirement. He could not, and would not, permit himself to acknowledge the labor. This continued denial was the final, elegant twist of the vindication. I did not need to fight him, I only needed to maintain my operational silence. Arthur Sterling was left trapped within the very lie he had constructed, forced to pretend that the colossal success surrounding him was not, in fact, the work of his dismissed daughter. Julian's wedding had occurred the following day, a subdued affair held against a backdrop that now screamed the uncomfortable truth of my existence. I had attended, not as a peripheral guest, but as the gracious, distant host, nodding coolly as Arthur Sterling tried, and failed, to meet my eye across the ballroom. The irony was palpable, they paid the market rate for the venue, every dollar flowing back into the Saffire portfolio, a constant, tangible tax on their denial. The true moment of ultimate clarity came not in a public confrontation, but in a routine, private review. One wet Tuesday afternoon, I was signing off on the operational reports when Elias Thorne, my CEO, discreetly informed me that Julian had requested access to the Cay's exclusive long-term mooring facilities for his new yacht. The request was formal, professional, and required my signature of approval. Did he mention his father? I asked Thorne, running a pen tip over the paper, the sound sharp in the quiet library. No, Miss Sterling. He dealt exclusively with the commercial operations manager. He is currently booked as Sterling, J. He is a client. He is a client. The finality of that designation was everything. Julian, the golden child, was now forced to navigate the professional channels of the sister he had always quietly condescended to. He could only access his desired luxury by submitting a request to the infrastructure I owned. I signed the approval, the pen gliding across the thick paper. It was not an act of generosity, nor an act of malice, it was merely sound business. I had achieved separation. My gaze drifted toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows that presented the endless, complex geometry of the Pacific. Arthur Sterling had always viewed my ambition as a deviation, a failure of character that required public pity. He never grasped the fundamental truth that success, when pursued in silence, is not about the applause, it is about the self-ownership of capacity. The journey was never about forcing Arthur Sterling to see my worth. It was about creating a reality where his opinion simply ceased to matter. The lavish display he attempted to orchestrate was held on my bedrock, yes, but the deeper truth was that my worth had long ago been calculated and affirmed by the banks, the architects, and the labor that built the resort, not by the small, privileged circle of men he sought approval from. I pushed the report away, the movement definitive. The visibility I had yearned for was secured. It was no longer a fight for recognition, but a quiet, profound peace. I had sought to correct the record, and in doing so, I had simply corrected my life, achieving an independence so complete that the lingering noise of the Sterling family was nothing more than the irrelevant, distant clatter of a ship dropping anchor in my harbor.